A lavish wedding reception. Crystal chandeliers casting golden light across a room filled with elegance and laughter. Champagne glasses clinking. Designer gowns sweeping across polished marble floors. Everything perfect. Everything flawless. And then in one brutal moment, everything stops. The bride, radiant in her $1,000 gown, recoils in disgust as the groom's mother reaches out to embrace her. The old woman's cane clatters to the floor. The bride's voice cuts through the celebration like a knife. "Don't touch me with those hands. You'll ruin my dress." Gasps ripple through the crowd. The elderly woman trembles, her weathered face flushing with shame. The groom stands frozen, his smile dying on his lips. And in that moment, nobody knew that this single act of cruelty would unravel a secret so devastating. It would bring an entire family to its knees and change everything forever. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Grace Harper had always believed she was destined for greatness. At 26, she had the kind of beauty that stopped conversations when she entered a room. Long auburn hair, eyes like emeralds, a smile that could charm anyone. She came from money, real money, the kind that bought summer homes and European vacations without a second thought. Her father owned a chain of luxury hotels. Her mother sat on charity boards and hosted galas. Grace grew up expecting the world to bow at her feet, and mostly, it did. So when she met Michael Chun at a charity fundraiser 18 months ago, she saw him as her perfect accessory. He was handsome, yes, but more importantly, he was successful. A self-made architect who'd built his firm from nothing. He drove a nice car, wore tailored suits, and carried himself with quiet confidence. What Grace didn't account for was his background. Michael hadn't grown up in penthouses and private schools. He'd grown up in a cramped apartment above a laundromat, raised by a single mother who cleaned houses and took in sewing to make ends meet. His mother, Esther Chun, was everything Grace's world had taught her to look down upon. Mama Esther was 63, her body bent by years of hard labor and a degenerative condition that had stolen her mobility. She walked with difficulty, relying on a cane, her hands gnarled from arthritis and an old injury that had never properly healed. But her spirit, that was something else entirely. She had eyes that sparkled with warmth, a laugh that could fill a room, and a faith that had carried her through poverty, widowhood, and pain. She'd worked 3 jobs to put Michael through college, never complaining, never asking for recognition. Michael was her entire world, and she his. Every accomplishment he celebrated, he credited to her sacrifice. Every milestone he reached, he shared with her first. Grace knew all this, of course. Michael spoke about his mother constantly during their courtship. How she'd saved every penny. How she'd encouraged him through failures. How she prayed for him every morning before dawn. Grace smiled and nodded through these stories, but inside, she felt nothing but impatience. She'd agreed to marry Michael despite his humble beginnings, not because of them. And she certainly hadn't signed up to play daughter to a crippled old woman who couldn't even afford decent clothes. During their engagement, Grace kept her distance from Mama Esther. She'd make excuses to skip family dinners. She'd schedule spa appointments during visits. When she did show up, she'd spend the entire time on her phone, barely acknowledging the older woman's attempts at conversation. Mama Esther noticed, of course. How could she not? But she'd smile gently and continue trying, hoping that perhaps Grace was just nervous, perhaps she needed time. One evening, about 3 months before the wedding, Mama Esther pulled Michael aside after Grace had left early, claiming a headache. They sat in the small kitchen where she'd raised him. The same cracked linoleum floor, the same humming refrigerator. She took her son's hand carefully. "Michael, my boy, I need to tell you something," she said softly. "A woman's beauty is nothing without kindness. I'm not saying Grace is a bad person, but I'm asking you, have you truly seen her heart? Have you tested what's beneath that pretty face?" Michael had laughed it off, kissing his mother's forehead. "Mama, you worry too much. Grace is just stressed with wedding planning. She'll warm up to you. I promise." Mama Esther had nodded, but the worry never left her eyes. She began praying harder, longer, asking God to either change Grace's heart or open Michael's eyes before it was too late. The wedding day arrived with all the grandeur Grace had demanded. She'd spared no expense, draining her parents' generosity and pressuring Michael to contribute far beyond his means. The venue was a historic mansion with manicured gardens and a ballroom that could host 300 guests. Everything was white and gold, from the floral arrangements to the bridesmaids' dresses. Grace looked stunning in a custom gown that cost more than some people's cars, her makeup airbrushed to perfection, her hair styled like a princess. Michael stood at the altar, handsome in his tuxedo, his eyes shining with love and hope. And somewhere in the back, seated far from the main guests as Grace had specifically instructed, sat Mama Esther in her wheelchair. She wore her best dress, a simple navy blue one she'd sewn herself, and clutched a small wrapped package in her lap. Despite everything, despite Grace's coldness and the obvious slight of being hidden away, Mama Esther's face glowed with joy for her son. This was his day. She'd prayed for this. She'd sacrificed for this. And she would celebrate it, even if it meant swallowing her own hurt. The ceremony went flawlessly. Vows were exchanged, rings were placed, and the kiss that sealed their union received thunderous applause. But the real moment everyone would remember, the moment that would haunt them all, came during the reception. After dinner, as the champagne flowed and the music played, there was a traditional moment for family blessings. Grace's parents went first, giving a speech about legacy and family values that rang hollow given how they'd initially objected to Michael. Then it was Mama Esther's turn. Michael wheeled his mother toward the center of the room himself, beaming with pride. Grace's smile tightened. She'd forgotten about this part. The old woman struggled to stand, using her cane for support, her body shaking with the effort. The room fell silent, watching this frail woman fight to honor her son. When she finally stood, she reached into the small bag hanging from her wheelchair and pulled out her gift. It wasn't wrapped in expensive paper or tied with silk ribbons. It was a simple cloth, about the size of a placemat, hand-sewn with uneven stitches. Across it, embroidered in shaky letters, were the words, "Love humbles the proud." Mama Esther's voice trembled as she spoke. "Grace, my daughter, I made this for you. It's not much, but it's made with all the love in my heart. I pray it reminds you that in marriage, we must lay down our pride and serve each other. I pray you'll." Grace cut her off with a laugh. Not a polite chuckle, but a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed through the silent ballroom. "You call this a gift?" she said, her voice dripping with contempt. "You should have just stayed home if this is all you could manage. I mean, really, what am I supposed to do with a rag?" The words hung in the air like poison. Gasps erupted from every corner. Someone's glass shattered on the floor. Mama Esther's face crumbled, tears immediately filling her eyes. Her hands, those gnarled, painful hands, trembled as she clutched the cloth. Michael stood frozen, his brain refusing to process what had just happened. His mother, the woman who'd given him everything, had just been humiliated by his wife in front of everyone they knew. Grace seemed to realize she'd crossed a line, but her pride wouldn't let her back down. She turned away, dismissing the older woman with a wave of her hand. "Someone please help her sit down. This is embarrassing." That night, after the guests had left in uncomfortable silence, after the photographers had packed up their equipment, after the fairy tale had shattered into 1,000 pieces, Michael didn't speak to his wife. He slept in a different room, his mind replaying that moment over and over. And Grace, alone in their honeymoon suite, felt the first stirring of something she'd never experienced before, genuine fear about what she'd done. The weeks following the wedding were strange and unsettling. Michael moved through their new home like a ghost, polite but distant. He went to work, came home, ate dinner in silence, and retreated to his office. Grace tried to brush it off, telling herself he'd get over it, that his mother had probably exaggerated her hurt, that everyone was being too sensitive. But then things started going wrong. Small things at first. Her car wouldn't start one morning, and the mechanic found sugar in the gas tank, though they lived in a secure building. Her business lunch with a potential client got canceled last minute because of a miscommunication. Her closest friends from college stopped returning her calls. Then the bigger problems hit. A major contract her father had promised her fell through unexpectedly. The investment she'd made in a friend's startup collapsed overnight, taking thousands of dollars with it. Her favorite designer boutique somehow lost her standing order and sold her reserved pieces to someone else. Grace didn't believe in karma or divine retribution, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the universe was punishing her. And every night, she had the same dream. She'd be standing in that ballroom again, but this time, she was the only one there. And Mama Esther would be sitting alone in the corner, crying softly, whispering words Grace couldn't quite hear. "You mocked what God loved," the old woman would say, over and over. "You mocked what God loved." 2 months after the wedding, Grace got a call that changed everything. It was Michael, his voice tight with panic. "It's Mama." She collapsed. "I'm at the hospital. Can you come?" Grace hesitated. Part of her wanted to make an excuse, to avoid facing the woman she'd humiliated. But something in Michael's voice, something broken and desperate, made her grab her keys and drive. She found him in the waiting room, his head in his hands, looking more defeated than she'd ever seen him. When he looked up and saw her, there was no warmth in his eyes, only exhaustion. "She hasn't been eating," he said quietly. "She's been depressed since the wedding. The doctors say her blood pressure is dangerously high and her body is just giving up." Grace felt something crack inside her chest, but she pushed it down. They sat in silence until a nurse emerged and said they could see her. Mama Esther looked so small in that hospital bed, hooked up to machines, her breathing shallow. Grace stood in the doorway, unable to move forward. And that's when she heard it. The nurse was speaking to another staff member just outside the room, not realizing Grace could hear. "Poor woman," the nurse said. "I read in her file that she sold her last piece of property to help pay for her son's wedding. That land was all she had left from her late husband. She gave it all away so her boy could have a nice celebration." Grace's knees went weak. The room spun. She stumbled backward, catching herself on the doorframe. That night, Grace couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing through every interaction she'd had with Mama Esther. The older woman's gentle smiles, her patient attempts at conversation, the way she'd look at Michael with such pure, unconditional love. And Grace had treated her like garbage. Worse than garbage. She'd humiliated her publicly, dismissed her gift, mocked her disability. The cloth. Grace suddenly remembered where she'd thrown it, in a drawer in the guest room, shoved beneath some towels. She got up, crept through the dark house and found it. Under the dim light of her phone, she examined it closely for the first time. The stitches were uneven, yes, but painstakingly careful. Some spots had small dots that Grace now realized were dried blood. Mama Esther's arthritic fingers bleeding as she worked. The embroidery was shaky but deliberate, each letter sewn with determination. "Love humbles the proud." Grace clutched the cloth to her chest and for the first time in years, maybe in her entire adult life, she cried. Not delicate tears, but deep, wrenching sobs that came from somewhere she'd kept locked away. She cried for her cruelty, for her pride, for the pain she'd caused a woman who'd only tried to love her. The next morning, Grace returned to the hospital. Michael was asleep in a chair beside his mother's bed. Grace approached quietly and sat on the other side, watching Mama Esther's face. After a long moment, she gently took the older woman's hand, the same hand she'd recoiled from weeks ago. It felt fragile, the skin paper thin, the bones prominent. Grace held it carefully as if it were made of glass. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." Mama Esther's eyes fluttered open. For a moment, she seemed confused, then focused on Grace's face. The younger woman expected anger, rejection, coldness. Instead, she saw only weariness and something else, something that looked almost like hope. "Child." Mama Esther's voice was barely audible. "Why are you here?" Grace's tears fell freely. "Because I was wrong. Because I was cruel. Because you gave everything for your son, for us, and I treated you like you were nothing. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm begging for it anyway." Mama Esther was quiet for a long time. Then slowly, painfully, she squeezed Grace's hand. "Love isn't proud, child. It doesn't keep score. You're still my daughter if your heart can kneel." Those words broke Grace completely. She laid her head on the bed, still holding Mama Esther's hand, and sobbed until she had no tears left. Michael woke up to find them like that, his mother and his wife, connected at last not by obligation, but by something real. Mama Esther's recovery was slow but steady. Grace visited every day, sometimes multiple times. She'd read to her, help her with physical therapy exercises, brush her hair gently. She started asking about Mama Esther's life, really listening this time. She heard stories about Michael's childhood, about the sacrifices made, about the faith that sustained them through poverty and hardship. And with each story, Grace's heart softened more. She began to understand what true love looked like, the kind that gives without counting the cost, that serves without seeking recognition, that forgives without conditions. One afternoon, while Mama Esther napped, Michael pulled Grace aside in the hospital cafeteria. His face was serious, and Grace braced herself for another confrontation. "Grace, I need to tell you something about Mama's hands. About why one of them doesn't work properly." Grace's heart hammered. She'd noticed that Mama Esther's right hand was worse than her left, more twisted, less mobile. "When I was 7, Michael began, his voice thick with emotion. "Our apartment building caught fire. Mama got me out, but then she heard screaming from the apartment next door. A little girl was trapped. Mama went back in." Grace's hand flew to her mouth. The floor collapsed. Mama fell, and burning debris landed on her arm. She lost most of the use of that hand, but she saved that little girl's life. She's always been like that, putting everyone else first, sacrificing her own body, her own comfort, her own happiness. Michael looked directly into Grace's eyes. "That cloth she gave you? She sewed it with that damaged hand. It took her 3 months because she could barely hold the needle. Every stitch caused her pain. And you called it a rag." Grace didn't remember leaving the cafeteria or getting to her car. She just found herself sitting in the parking lot, shaking violently, the weight of her cruelty crushing her. She'd mocked a hero. She'd dismissed the sacrifice of a woman who'd literally walked through fire to save a child. What kind of person had she become? How had she let pride blind her so completely? That night, Grace made a decision. She couldn't undo what she'd done, but she could honor what she'd learned. Within weeks, she'd started planning. She liquidated some of her personal investments, called in favors from her family's connections, and began building something new. 6 months after that terrible wedding day, after Mama Esther had recovered enough to leave the hospital, Grace invited her and Michael to a special event. Mama Esther was confused when they arrived at a newly renovated community center in a neighborhood she recognized, close to where she'd raised Michael. Inside, dozens of women were gathered, many elderly, some in wheelchairs, some with visible disabilities. There was food, music, and warmth. At the front of the room hung a large banner. Mama Esther's Hands, a center for widows and women in need. Grace stood on a small stage, holding a microphone with trembling hands. 6 months ago, she began, her voice catching, "I committed one of the most shameful acts of my life. I humiliated a woman who'd sacrificed everything for the man I love. I mocked her disability, dismissed her gift, and showed contempt for her efforts. That woman is here today. Mama Estherkin." She gestured to where Mama Esther sat, tears already streaming down the older woman's face. "Mama Esther taught me what I'd forgotten. That love isn't about pride or status or material things. Love humbles us. Love serves. Love sacrifices. And these hands," Grace held up the cloth that Mama Esther had sewn, now framed and hanging beside the banner. "These hands that I once rejected, they represent everything beautiful about what it means to truly love someone." The room erupted in applause. Grace continued through her tears. "This center is dedicated to women like Mama Esther, women who've given everything and received little recognition. Women who've sacrificed their bodies, their comfort, their resources for others. Here they'll receive support, community, resources, and most importantly, honor." Michael was openly weeping now, his arm around his mother. Mama Esther reached up and gently wiped his tears, then looked at Grace with such profound love that Grace nearly collapsed from the weight of it. The weeks and months that followed brought healing that Grace hadn't known was possible. She worked at the center regularly, not as a board member or figurehead, but as a volunteer, serving meals, listening to stories, helping with whatever was needed. She learned humility not from a book or a sermon, but from the hands of women who'd lived it daily. Michael watched his wife transform, and slowly the distance between them closed. They began talking again, really talking, about fears and failures and hopes. Their marriage, which had started with such superficial glamour, began to build on something solid. Mama Esther became Grace's closest confidant. They'd sit together in the center's garden, Mama Esther sharing wisdom while Grace soaked it in like rain after a drought. "You know," Mama Esther said one sunny afternoon, "I prayed for you before Michael even met you. I asked God to send my son a woman with a beautiful heart. I didn't know he'd send someone whose heart needed to be broken open first." Grace smiled through tears. "I'm glad he did. I'm glad you didn't give up on me." Mama Esther patted her hand gently. "Child, love never gives up. That's the whole point." A year after the wedding, Grace and Michael held a small ceremony at the center. This time, there were no crystal chandeliers or $1,000 gowns. Grace wore a simple white dress. Michael wore a casual suit. And Mama Esther, standing with the help of her cane but standing nonetheless, gave a blessing that everyone present would remember forever. "Marriage is a mirror," she said softly. "It shows us who we really are, not who we pretend to be." These two started with pride and pain, but they chose to transform it into humility and love. May we all learn from their journey. As Grace and Michael renewed their vows to each other, this time with full understanding of what they meant, Grace caught sight of the framed cloth hanging on the wall. "Love humbles the proud." She'd learned that lesson the hardest way possible. But she'd learned it. And she'd spend the rest of her life living it. Because true beauty isn't found in flawless appearances or impressive achievements. It's found in the willingness to kneel, to serve, to admit when you're wrong, and to honor the people who give everything while asking nothing in return. It's found in hands that work until they bleed, in hearts that forgive the unforgivable, and in love that endures through humiliation and comes out stronger on the other side. So if you were in Grace's position, watching your pride destroy something precious, what would you do? Would you have the courage to admit you were wrong? Would you humble yourself before someone you'd hurt? And if you were Mama Esther, could you forgive someone who'd humiliated you in front of everyone you knew? Think about it. Because somewhere in your life, there's probably someone whose hands you've dismissed, whose sacrifice you've overlooked, whose love you've taken for granted. Maybe today is the day you see them differently. Maybe today is the day you kneel. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. And if you think this journey was powerful, wait until you hear about the woman who discovered her husband's secret family on their anniversary night. That story is coming next, and trust me, you won't want to miss it.